Mom, starting with your next paycheck, we're transferring all your money to my account. Those were the words my son Kevin Reed spoke to me that Thursday afternoon while drinking coffee in my kitchen. He said it as if he were proposing something completely normal, as if he were doing me a favor, as if I were incapable of managing my own money at 62 years old. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from. I stared at him. I didn't say anything for a few seconds. I just searched his eyes for an explanation. Why my own son, the boy I raised alone, the man I fed with the sweat of my brow, was asking for total access to my bank account. But I found nothing. I only saw that calm smile, that confidence of a person who knows he's in control. So I took a deep breath and told him yes, that it seemed fine, that I trusted him. Kevin's smile widened. He stood up, gave me a quick mechanical kiss on the forehead, one of those kisses that mean nothing, and told me it was for the best. He said I wouldn't have to worry about a thing, that he'd take care of everything, that it was for my own good. Those words, for my own good, floated in the air long after he'd left my house. That very evening, like every Friday, Kevin came back, not alone but with his wife Jessica, just as he always did. He arrived expecting me to have dinner ready, the table set, hot and free food waiting for them, as had been the routine every Friday for the past 3 years. I heard them arrive. I heard their footsteps at the entrance. I heard the key I'd given him turning in the lock. I heard the door open, and then I heard the scream. It was a high-pitched, desperate sound. The scream of someone who'd just seen something they never expected to see. The cry of someone realizing things weren't going to be the way they thought. I remained seated in my chair in the empty kitchen, in the empty house, listening to that scream echo against the walls. I didn't move. I didn't go to see what was happening. I already knew what was happening. Kevin rushed into the kitchen. His face was pale, his eyes wide open. Jessica followed him with the same expression of shock and disbelief. "Mom!" Kevin yelled. "Mom, what did you do? Where is everything? Where's the furniture? Where's the TV? Where's everything that was here?" I looked at him calmly with a self-possession I didn't know I had. I told him in the softest voice I could find that I had sold a few things, that I needed the cash. After all, if he was going to handle my finances, I needed to make sure I had some money on hand first. His face changed from pale to red with pure fury. He took a step toward me, and for the first time in my life, I saw my son for what he truly was. Not the boy I had raised, not the young man I had helped build his life, but a stranger, someone who looked at me with contempt, with rage, with something that dangerously resembled hate. "You're crazy," he snapped. "You are completely out of your mind. How could you sell things without consulting me? How are we supposed to watch TV when we come over? How are we going to be comfortable here?" That last sentence changed everything. How are we going to be comfortable here? Not how are you going to be comfortable, Mom? He wasn't worried about how this affected me, but about how they would be comfortable, as if my house were an extension of theirs, as if my possessions existed for their convenience. Jessica stepped closer. She looked at me with those eyes that always seemed cold and calculating, and said something I will never forget. She said I was being selfish, that I was only thinking about myself, that they came every week to keep me company, to make sure I was doing well, and this was how I repaid them. Selfish. Me, the woman who had worked double shifts for years so Kevin could go to college. The woman who had given up on rebuilding her life after his father abandoned us because she didn't want her son to grow up with a stepfather. The woman who had lived in small apartments, worn old clothes, and eaten the bare minimum so he could have everything he needed. Selfish. Kevin stood there looking at me as if I were a problem he needed to solve, And then he said something that broke me in two. He said maybe it had been a mistake to propose the bank account transfer, that maybe I wasn't in any condition to make good decisions, that perhaps I needed more help than he thought. More help, as if I were a burden, an incapable elderly woman who needed to be controlled. I stood up from my chair. I looked at both of them and told them in a voice that came out louder than I expected that dinner was not ready, that there was no dinner, and that if they were hungry, they could go eat somewhere else. The silence that followed was thick, heavy. Kevin stared at me as if he couldn't believe what he just heard. Jessica let out a dry, bitter laugh and mumbled something about respect and gratitude. And then Kevin spoke the final line, the one I still hear in my head when I close my eyes at night. He said, with a coldness I'd never known him to possess, that I should be careful. A woman my age, alone, without family who truly cared about her, could end up in a bad way. He said he was the only thing I had, and I should remember that before doing anything stupid. They left. They stormed out of my house, slamming doors, leaving a trail of rage and veiled threats. I heard them get into the car, heard the engine start, and listened as they drove away. I stood there in my empty kitchen, in my empty house, feeling something inside me permanently shatter. But it wasn't sadness I felt. It wasn't desperation. It was something different. It was clarity. It was the absolute certainty that my son didn't love me, that perhaps he never had, that I was just a resource to him, a source of money, food, and convenience. I sat back down in my chair. I looked at the bare walls of my living room. I looked at the empty spaces where furniture I'd bought with my labor and effort once stood. And for the first time in a very long time, I smiled. Because Kevin didn't know something. He didn't know I hadn't sold the furniture for money. I had sold it to send a message, to see how he would react, to confirm what I already suspected deep down in my heart. And he had reacted exactly as I expected, with rage, with indignation, with the attitude of someone who feels entitled to another person's things. That night, as I sat in the darkness of my empty house, I made a decision. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to do something much more powerful. I was going to observe. I was going to wait. I was going to let Kevin believe he had won. And then, when he least expected it, when he was most confident, most sure of his control over me, I was going to show him who Denise Reed truly was. Not the submissive mother he thought he knew, but the woman who had survived a broken marriage, poverty, and grueling hard work. The woman who knew exactly how to protect herself. The woman he should never have underestimated. There was a time when I believed being a mother was enough, that the love I gave would be naturally returned, as if it were a universal law that the sacrifices I made every day would build something solid, something unbreakable between my son and me. How wrong I was. Kevin was born on a stormy night 34 years ago. His father, Michael, the man who had promised me a life together, left when the boy was barely 2. He said he wasn't ready to be a dad, that he needed to find himself, and that I would understand someday. I never understood, but I also didn't wait for him to return. I was left alone with a small child, a 2-bedroom apartment I could barely afford, and a secretarial job that paid $800 a month. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. So I got a second job cleaning offices at night. I would leave Kevin with my neighbor, Mrs. Sarah Washington, an older lady who charged me $50 a week to watch him. I worked from 7 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock in the evening at the office. I'd come home, feed Kevin, bathe him, put him to bed, and then head out again at 9 o'clock at night to clean buildings until 2 o'clock in the morning. I slept 4 hours and started all over again. I did this for years, so many years that I lost count. I remember Kevin always wanted the brand name sneakers the other kids at school wore. They cost $100. I earned maybe $1,700 a month between both jobs. $100 was almost all the money I had for groceries for 2 weeks, but I bought them for him. I didn't want my son to feel less than anyone else. I wanted him to know his mother would do anything for him. I ate rice and beans for an entire month to pay for those sneakers. When Kevin turned 18, he wanted to go to a private college that cost $10,000 a year. I didn't have that money. I didn't even have a tenth of that money. But I went to the bank and took out a loan. I went into debt for 4 full years of education, which I ended up paying off over 10 years. 10 years of paying a loan so my son could have a college degree. He graduated, got a good job. He earned $6,000 a month, double what I made after 30 years of working. And I was happy. I thought he could finally build his life. I thought I had finally done my job as a mother well. But Kevin didn't move out right away. He said he wanted to save money, that he wanted to have a solid base before becoming independent. I told him, "Of course this is your home. You can stay as long as you need." He stayed 5 more years. 5 years where I kept working both my jobs. 5 years where I paid the rent, bought the food, and covered the utilities. 5 years where Kevin saved every single penny of his salary because he didn't have to pay for anything. When he finally left, it wasn't to rent an apartment. It was to buy a house, a $300,000 house that he paid for in cash because he had saved all his money during those 5 years of living for free in my home. I was proud. I told him I was proud. And I was. I thought I had done well to help him. I thought that now that he had his own house, maybe he could help me. Maybe I could work less. Maybe I could rest a little. But that never happened. Kevin got married 2 years after moving out. His wife, Jessica, was an elegant woman, one of those who always dressed well, always had perfect nails, and always spoke in a tone that sounded polite but hid a certain coldness. I noticed from the start that she looked at me differently, as if I were somehow inferior, as if she didn't understand why Kevin came from where he came from. At the wedding, which cost $30,000, I sat at a back table, not at the head table with the family. Kevin explained it was because there were a lot of important people, clients from his work, and they needed those tables for them. I said I understood. I smiled in the photos, danced when asked, and went home alone that night, feeling strangely empty. After the wedding, Kevin's visits became less frequent. Before, he came to see me 2 or 3 times a week. After he got married, he came once every 2 weeks, then once a month, always in a rush, always looking at his phone, always with some excuse to leave early. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be the heavy mother, the complaining mother, the mother who didn't understand her son had his own life now. But then they started coming on Friday nights, always around dinner time, always unannounced, always expecting me to have food ready. At first, I was delighted. I thought Kevin finally wanted to spend time with me, that he finally missed me. So I cooked his favorite dishes, set the table nicely, bought dessert. But I noticed something. I noticed Kevin never came alone. He always brought Jessica. And I noticed they never came to chat. They came to eat. They arrived, sat down, ate, and left. Sometimes they stayed an hour, sometimes less. I also noticed he never brought anything. Never a bottle of wine, never a dessert, never money to help with the food, nothing. One night after they left, I calculated how much I had spent on the dinner. $15. Money I didn't have to spare. $15 meant I would have to work extra hours to compensate. And I realized something. I realized that for Kevin, I had become a service, a free restaurant, a place where he could come to eat without paying, without even truly saying thank you. I began to notice other things too. I noticed that when I asked him for help with something, he always had an excuse. When I needed him to take me to the doctor because my car was broken, he was always too busy. When I mentioned my refrigerator was making strange noises and I was afraid it would break soon, he told me to buy a new one, as if I had $500 saved for emergencies. I didn't. I barely had enough to make it to the end of the month. But the worst was my birthday, my 60th birthday. Kevin arrived 2 hours late with no gift, no card, and an excuse about traffic. He stayed 20 minutes. He ate the cake I had bought for myself because I didn't want to spend the day alone. And then he left. I cried that night. I cried like I hadn't cried in years because I finally understood something I had been denying for too long. I understood that to my son I was no longer important. I was just a resource, something that was there, available, waiting to be used when he needed it. And the worst part was that I had allowed it. I had set that pattern. I had never asked him for anything. I had never told him I felt used. I had never told him I needed more from him than just 20-minute visits and Friday night dinners. I was afraid. Afraid that if I complained, if I asked, if I demanded, he would disappear completely. And the idea of losing my son, even this son who barely saw me, terrified me more than anything else. So I continued being the convenient mother, the silent mother, the mother who was always there, who always had the door open, who never caused trouble. Until that Thursday afternoon, until Kevin told me he wanted to manage my money. Something inside me, something that had been dormant for years, woke up. A small but clear voice that told me this wasn't right, that this was the beginning of something worse. But even then, even with that voice whispering in my head, I told him yes, because I still had hope. I still wanted to believe my son loved me, that he would protect me, that he would do the right thing. How foolish I was. The following Monday, Kevin came to my house with papers, lots of papers. He spread them out on the kitchen table with that smile that now seemed different, less warm, more calculated. "Mom, this is simple," he said. "I just need you to sign here, here, and here. These are the documents so I can have access to your account, so I can automatically transfer your salary every month. That way, I'll take care of paying your bills, managing everything. You won't have to worry about a thing." I looked at the papers. They were bank forms, authorization forms. I read the fine print, the parts people usually ignore, and I saw something that chilled my blood. It wasn't just access to my account. It was full power of attorney. It was the authority to make transfers, to close accounts, to make financial decisions on my behalf. "Kevin, this says you would have total control over my money," I told him. He nodded as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "Yes, Mom. It's easier that way. That way I can handle everything without having to ask you for authorization every time. It's for practicality." Practicality? That word echoed in my head. Practicality for whom? I wondered, but I didn't say it out loud. I took the pen he offered me. I held it in my hand, and for a moment I was about to sign. I was about to give him everything because that's what I had always done. Trust, surrender, believe. But then I remembered Friday night. I remembered his face contorted in fury when he saw the empty house. I remembered his words. I remembered how he had threatened me, even though he probably didn't even realize it was a threat. I put the pen down on the table. "You know what, Kevin? Give me a few days to think about it. I want to read everything calmly. I want to be sure." His expression changed for just a second. A flash of irritation crossed his face before he smiled again. "Mom, there's nothing to think about. It's simple. But okay. If you want to take a few days, that's fine." He left then, but he left the papers, as if assuming I would eventually sign them anyway. I couldn't sleep that night. I stayed up looking at those papers on the kitchen table, and something inside me told me this was not for my good. that this was the beginning of something I wouldn't be able to reverse once it started. The next day, I went to the bank. I went early before my job. I asked the teller to review my account to show me all the transactions for the last 6 months. She printed the papers. They were several pages long. I reviewed them carefully, line by line, and then I saw it. I saw it, and I felt the floor move beneath my feet. There was a withdrawal I hadn't made, a withdrawal of $2,000 from 3 months ago. $1,000 that had left my account, and I didn't remember taking it out. I asked the teller if she could see more details. She checked her computer and told me something that took my breath away. She said the withdrawal had been made at a branch across town using my debit card, but I had never gone to that branch, and my card was in my wallet. It had always been in my wallet, except for once. I remembered then. I remembered that 3 months ago, Kevin had come to visit. I was in the shower when he arrived. I yelled for him to come in, that the door was open. When I came out, he was waiting for me in the living room. We sat down to chat, and at some point I went to the kitchen to make coffee. My wallet was in my purse. My purse was in the living room, with Kevin. I felt nauseated. I felt the whole world tilting strangely because this could only mean one thing. It meant my son had taken my card, memorized or photographed the numbers, and withdrawn money from my account without my permission. I asked the teller if there was any way to know exactly what had happened with that withdrawal. She told me I needed to file a formal claim, that the bank would investigate, which could take several weeks. I told her I'd think about it, and I left the bank feeling like I no longer knew my own son. But I didn't file the claim. Not yet, because I needed to be sure. I needed to know if this had been just once, or if there was more. I spent the next few days checking everything, every piece of paper I had in my house, every document, every old bank statement I had kept in a box in my closet. And I found more things. I found that 2 years ago, when I was in the hospital with pneumonia, someone had used my health insurance for consultations I hadn't made, appointments at clinics I didn't know, consultations that had exhausted my annual coverage, which was why I had had to pay out of pocket for some medications that year. I also found a credit card in my name that I didn't remember applying for. A card with a balance of $3,000. $3,000 in purchases I hadn't made at stores I'd never been to. I called the credit card bank. I asked them when the account had been opened. They told me 18 months ago. I asked if they could tell me where the purchases had been made. They gave me a list. Hardware stores, electronic shops, home furnishing stores. Kevin had bought a house 2 years ago. Kevin had renovated that house, and apparently, Kevin had used my credit to do it. I sat on the floor of my room, surrounded by papers, feeling everything I had believed about my life crumble. It wasn't just the money. It was the betrayal. It was knowing my son had been robbing me for years, that he had viewed me as an unlimited resource, that he had never intended to care for or protect me. I cried until I had no tears left. Then I wiped my face, gathered all the papers, and made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him yet. I wasn't going to yell or accuse him because I knew if I did, he would deny everything. He'd say I was confused. He'd say I was senile. He'd say anything to make me doubt my own memory, my own sanity. No, I was going to be smarter than that. I was going to gather evidence. I was going to document everything. I was going to build a case so solid he couldn't deny it. And then, only then, would I act. On Friday of that week, Kevin came back as always at dinner time, as always expecting me to have food ready. But this time, I had cooked differently. I had made his favorite dish, chicken and rice. The same meal I used to make when he was a boy and came home sad from school. The dish that told him how much I loved him without needing words. He sat at the table with Jessica. They ate. They talked about superficial things. Work, the weather, the new movie they wanted to see. I watched them. I watched them as if I were seeing them for the first time and realized something. I realized Kevin ate my food with the same indifference he would eat fast food. There was no gratitude in his eyes, no love, just the mechanical act of eating something free. When they finished, Kevin pulled out the bank papers again. He placed them on the table right next to his empty plate. "Mom, the days you asked for are up. You've thought about it, right? Sign this and I'll take care of everything." I looked him straight in the eyes and told him in the calmest voice I could find that I still wasn't sure, that I needed more time. Jessica scoffed. "Denise, this is ridiculous. Kevin is just trying to help you. I don't understand why you're so distrustful." Distrustful? She called me distrustful. And the saddest part was she was right, but not in the way she thought. Kevin stood up. His expression was hard now, without the mask of a smile. "Mom, this is for your own good. You can't keep managing your finances alone. It's obvious. Look how you sold the furniture without thinking. Look at the irrational decisions you're making." Irrational. Selling my own furniture in my own house was irrational, but robbing me for years wasn't. I didn't say anything. I just held his gaze until he looked away. They left that night without saying goodbye, and I stayed seated in my kitchen, staring at those unsigned papers, knowing the war was just beginning. A silent war, a war I had to win because if I lost it, I wouldn't just lose my money. I would lose my dignity, my autonomy, my life. The days after that dinner grew strange. Kevin didn't call again. He didn't visit again. It was as if he had decided to punish me with his absence, as if he believed I would break down without him, that I would beg him to return, that I would finally sign those papers just to get his attention back. But I didn't break down. For the first time in years, the silence of my house didn't feel empty. It felt full of something different. It felt full of clarity. I spent those days reviewing every detail of my financial life. Every receipt I had saved, every bank statement, every piece of paper that had any connection to money. And the more I checked, the more I found. I discovered that 3 years ago, when Kevin asked to borrow my ID because he had lost his and needed to pick up an urgent package, he had done something more with it. He had opened a utility account in my name at an address that wasn't mine, his house. For 3 years, the electricity bill for Kevin's house had been in my name, and when he didn't pay on time, the penalties piled up on my credit score. That was why I had been denied a small loan last year when my car needed urgent repairs. That was why my credit score had mysteriously dropped. I called the utility company. I explained that the account wasn't mine, that I had never lived at that address. The woman on the phone told me I needed to file an affidavit, that I had to report this as identity fraud. Identity fraud committed by my own son. I hung up the phone and stared at the wall for a long time, trying to process how I had reached this point, trying to understand when my son had turned into this. I couldn't sleep that night. I stayed awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city outside. And I thought about all the times I had justified his behavior, all the times I had told myself he was busy, that he had his own life, that I was being demanding by expecting more from him. But this wasn't about expectations. This was about theft, about deception, about a son who viewed his mother as a resource he could exploit without consequence. The next morning, I did something I had never done. I went to see a lawyer. It was a small office downtown. The sign read Eric Morgan, attorney at law. I had seen an ad for him in the paper offering free consultations. I walked in feeling small, feeling ridiculous, a woman of 62 coming to complain about her own son. but the receptionist smiled kindly and showed me in. Eric Morgan was a man in his 50s with graying temples and kind eyes. He asked me to tell him everything, and I did. I told him about the missing money, the credit card I hadn't applied for, the utility account, the papers Kevin wanted me to sign. He listened without interrupting. He took notes in a notepad, and when I finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with a mixture of compassion and seriousness. "Mrs. Reed," he said, "what you are describing is financial fraud and abuse of trust. If you sign those papers your son is asking for, you are giving him total legal access to your money. He could empty everything, and you would have no legal recourse because you gave him permission yourself." The words fell on me like stones. I knew it deep down. I knew it, but hearing it spoken aloud by a professional made it real in a different way. "What can I do?" I asked. He leaned forward. "First, don't sign anything. Second, you need to report the credit card fraud and the theft from your bank account. Third, you need to change all your passwords, your PIN, everything. Fourth, consider getting a restraining order if you feel you are in danger." A restraining order against my own son. The idea seemed absurd and devastating at the same time. "I don't want to get him into legal trouble," I said. "He's my son." The lawyer looked at me with what looked like compassion and sadness. "Miss Reed, your son is already in legal trouble. He's committed several felonies. The question isn't whether you want to get him into trouble. The question is whether you want to protect yourself." I left that office with a folder full of forms and a list of things I needed to do. I felt overwhelmed. But I also felt something else. I felt determination. I went straight to the bank. I changed all my passwords, requested a new debit card, closed the fraudulent credit card, and filed a formal dispute. The teller helped me with everything. She treated me with patience without making me feel stupid or weak. When I arrived home that afternoon, I felt exhausted but also strangely light, as if an invisible weight I had been carrying for years had been lifted. That night, Kevin finally called. His voice sounded strained on the phone. "Mom, we need to talk. Come to my house for dinner tomorrow. We have to resolve this." It wasn't an invitation. It was an order. And before, I would have obeyed without question. But now, after everything I had discovered, I felt only a cold calm. "I can't tomorrow," I told him. "I'm busy." "Busy? Mom, what could you possibly be busy with?" "What I'm busy with is important to me," I said. "There are other things that matter more to me now." There was silence on the other end of the line. A silence heavy with surprise and irritation. "You're acting really weird, Mom. I don't know what's wrong with you, but you need to stop being so stubborn and sign those papers. This is for your own good." "For my own good?" Those words again, as if robbing me were an act of love. "Kevin," I said with a voice that came out firmer than I expected, "I am not signing anything, and I think we need to have a very serious conversation about a few things." "About what things?" he asked. His voice sounded different now, more alert, more cautious. "About money that has left my account without my permission. About credit cards I didn't apply for. About utility accounts in my name at addresses where I don't live." The silence that followed was absolute, so thick I could almost feel it through the phone. "I don't know what you're talking about," he finally said. His voice sounded controlled, but I could detect the panic underneath. "I think you do know," I told him. "And I think you need to think very carefully about what you're going to say next. Mom, you're delusional. You're confused. Maybe you need to see a doctor." There was the card I knew he would play. The card of making me seem senile, confused, incapable. "I'm not confused, Kevin. I have all the papers. I have all the evidence, and I've already spoken with a lawyer." Another silence. This one longer, heavier. "You talked to a lawyer?" His voice was almost a whisper now, almost a threat. Yes. And he explained to me exactly what you've been doing. He explained what fraud is. He explained what is illegal. Mom, you can't be serious. I'm your son. Everything I've done has been to help you. Help me, Kevin? You robbed me for years. You used me. You lied to me. I never, he started to say, but I cut him off. Yes, you did. And you know it. The question now is what we're going to do about it. I heard his breathing on the other end of the line, heavy, ragged. I'm coming over, he said. We need to talk in person. No, I told him. You are not coming here. If you want to talk, we can do it over the phone, or we can do it with lawyers present. Are you crazy? He yelled. Completely crazy. After everything I've done for you, after all the times I've come to see you, that I've worried about you, this is how you repay me. All the times you came to eat for free, you mean? All the times you needed something from me. But the times I needed you, where were you? I hung up then, before he could answer, before he could manipulate me again with words. I stayed seated in my kitchen with the phone in my hand, trembling, but not from fear, from rage, from years and years of suppressed rage that was finally finding its voice. I slept better that night than I had in months, because I had finally spoken the truth. I had finally defended my territory. And although I didn't know what would come next, I knew I was no longer going to be the silent mother who allowed herself to be trampled. The next day, I did something else I had never done before. I went to visit Sarah Washington, my neighbor from when Kevin was a child. She was now 70 years old and had moved to a small apartment across town. We had kept in touch over the years, but our contact had become less frequent as time passed. I arrived at her building at 3 p.m. I rang the doorbell, and when she opened the door, her face lit up with a smile. Denise Reed, what a surprise. Come in, come in. Her apartment was small but cozy, filled with plants and photographs. She made us tea and we sat in her living room. We talked about trivial things at first. The weather, her grandchildren, the new manager of the building. But then she looked at me with those wise eyes that had seen so much in life and said, "You look different, Denise. There's something in your eyes. What happened?" And I told her everything. I told her about Kevin, about the money, about the fraud, about the threats. I talked for almost an hour without stopping, and she listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, her face showing a mixture of sadness and something that seemed like recognition. When I finished, she sighed deeply. I always thought there was something off about that boy, even when he was little, when you left him with me. There was something calculating in the way he looked at things, at people. But I didn't say anything because what does an old lady know, right? And you loved him so much. She reached out and took my hand in hers. Her fingers were cool, but her grip was firm. I need to ask you a favor, I said. I need you to be my witness. I need that if Kevin comes and tries to say I'm confused, that I'm senile, you can confirm that's not true, that I'm in full possession of my faculties. She nodded without hesitation. Of course. And more than that, if you need a place to stay, if you ever don't feel safe in your house, my door is open. Those words filled me with such deep gratitude that I almost cried, but I didn't cry. I had cried enough. Now it was time to act. That night, back in my house, I organized all the documents I had collected. I put them in a large folder. I made copies of everything, stored the originals in a safe place, and left the copies in the folder. If something happened to me, if Kevin tried to do anything, there would be evidence. There would be proof. I also wrote a letter detailing everything I had discovered, everything Kevin had done. I put it in a sealed envelope with instructions that it should only be opened in case of emergency. I gave it to Sarah to hold on to. I was preparing myself like a general preparing for battle because I knew Kevin wasn't going to let this go. I knew he would come, that he would try to manipulate me, to convince me, to make me doubt myself. But I was no longer the same woman I had been 2 weeks ago. That woman had died the night Kevin threatened me in my own kitchen. The woman I was now was different. She was stronger, clearer, more determined, and she was ready for whatever came next. On Wednesday afternoon, as I was making tea, I heard a car stop in front of my building. I looked out the window and saw Kevin's car. He got out along with Jessica. They looked determined. They were coming to confront me. I took a deep breath, put away my cup of tea, and waited. The doorbell rang once, twice, 3 times, each time more insistent. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. I stood on the threshold, blocking the entrance. "We need to talk," Kevin said. His voice was hard with no pretense of kindness. "I'm listening," I told him. "Inside, Mom. We're not going to talk in the hallway." "We don't have anything to talk about inside. Whatever you have to say, you can say it here." Jessica scoffed. "This is ridiculous, Denise. Stop acting like we're enemies." "You're not enemies," I replied. "Enemies are honest about their hostility. You're worse. You're thieves hiding behind pretty words." Kevin took a step toward me. His face was red with fury. "How dare you, after everything I've done for you?" "Everything you've done for me, Kevin? I have the records. I have the proof. I know exactly how much money you've stolen from me. I know about the fraudulent credit cards. I know about the utility account. I know about everything." He froze. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "And now," I continued with a calmness that surprised even myself, "you have 2 options. Either you give me back everything you stole, every cent, or I go to the police and press charges for fraud." "You can't do that," Jessica said. "He's your son." "Precisely why it hurts so much," I replied. "Because he is my son, because I gave him everything, and he repaid me by robbing me." Kevin finally found his voice. "You owe me," he shouted. "My whole life I grew up without a father. My whole life I had to watch you work and be tired. That was your fault. You chose to have me. You chose to stay alone. I didn't ask to be born." His words landed like punches, but they no longer hurt the way they used to, because now I could see them for what they were. Justifications. Excuses from someone who knew he had done something unforgivable and was trying to shift the blame. "You're right," I told him. "I chose to have you, and it was the best decision of my life until it stopped being the best. But that doesn't give you the right to steal from me. That doesn't give you the right to exploit me." "I didn't steal anything. I just took what was owed to me." "Nothing was owed to you, Kevin. I gave you everything you needed when you were a child. Once you became an adult, it was no longer my obligation. And it was definitely not my obligation to give you access to my money without my knowledge." Jessica grabbed his arm. "Let's go. It's not worth it. She's already lost it." Lost it? What an interesting choice of words. As if I were the one who was wrong. As if defending my own money and dignity were madness. They left then. They walked down the stairs without looking back, and I closed the door, feeling strangely at peace. That night, Eric Morgan called me. He told me the banks had confirmed the fraud, that the credit card debt would be canceled, that they were investigating the unauthorized withdrawals, and that I had a solid case if I chose to press criminal charges. I thanked him and hung up. I sat in my empty living room in my house that no longer had a television or fancy furniture. And for the first time in a long time, I felt rich. Rich in something money couldn't buy. Rich in dignity, in strength, in the certainty that I was doing the right thing. The days that followed that confrontation at my door were strangely silent, as if the whole world were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I found myself caught in a kind of emotional limbo where rage and pain mixed with a growing sense of liberation that I didn't know how to fully process. Kevin didn't call again. He didn't show up at my door again. And for the first time in years, I wasn't constantly waiting for his contact. I wasn't checking my phone every hour to see if there was a message from him. I wasn't inventing excuses in my mind to justify his absence or his silence. But although he wasn't physically present in my life during those days, his digital presence was impossible to ignore. Something in me led me to check his social media, something I normally wouldn't do, as it always seemed like an invasion of privacy, even for a mother. But now, I felt I had the right to know what he was doing, what he was saying, how he was presenting his life to the world, while I dealt with the consequences of his actions in private. What I found took my breath away with its audacity, its absolute disconnection between reality and the image he was projecting outward. He had posted a photo the day after our confrontation, a photo of him and Jessica at a fancy restaurant, smiling at the camera with glasses of wine in their hands. The caption said something about celebrating the release of toxic energy and surrounding oneself only with people who add value to life, as if I were the toxicity he needed to liberate himself from, as if my refusal to let myself be robbed further was some kind of negativity he had the wisdom to eliminate from his existence. The comments below the photo were all positive, all congratulating him for protecting his peace of mind, for setting healthy boundaries, for prioritizing his emotional well-being. I stared at the screen, feeling a mix of disbelief and disgust, because all those people supporting him had no idea that the man they were celebrating had been robbing his own mother for years. There were more posts in the following days, each one more elaborate than the last, as if Kevin were deliberately constructing a public narrative of his life that had absolutely nothing to do with the truth. I saw a photo of him at the gym with a reflection on self-care and the importance of investing in oneself before being able to help others. Words that sounded deep and meaningful, until you remembered this was the same man who had used stolen money from his mother to buy gym memberships and expensive sportswear. Another photo of him working on his computer with a comment about the sacrifice and hard work it takes to build a successful future, without mentioning that this future had been partially financed with fraudulent credit cards in my name and utility accounts I was unknowingly paying for. What impacted me most was a post he made that Friday, exactly the day he would normally have come to my house for dinner. A post where he shared an old photo of him and me when he was a child. A photo I didn't even know he had. A photo where I was holding him in my arms when he was perhaps 5 years old, and we were both smiling. The text accompanying the photo was something about how sometimes the people you love the most are the ones who hurt you the most. About how he had learned that love doesn't mean tolerating abusive behavior. About how he had made the difficult decision to distance himself from a toxic family relationship for the sake of his mental health. Reading those words, I felt as if someone had punched me in the stomach. Kevin had taken our history, our real relationship with all its complicated and painful nuances, and completely inverted it, presenting himself as the victim and me as the abuser. The comments on that post were even more abundant than the previous ones. Dozens of people expressing their support, telling him how brave he was for setting those boundaries, sharing their own stories of difficult family relationships, completely validating his fabricated version of events. There were people I knew in those comments. Neighbors who had known him when he lived with me, co-workers who had come to parties at my house years ago, all of them offering words of encouragement and solidarity without the slightest idea that the person he supposedly needed to protect himself from was the same woman who had worked 2 jobs for years to give him the education he now used to get his well-paying job. For several days, I watched this digital spectacle in silence, without commenting, without publicly reacting in any way, because something in me knew that this was exactly the game Kevin was playing. If I responded emotionally, I would be falling into his trap, giving him more ammunition for his narrative that I was the unstable, problematic mother he needed to distance himself from. But every new post, every new comment of support he received from people who didn't know the truth was like a small wound opening deep inside me. Not because I cared what those people thought of me specifically, but because it hurt to see how easily people believed a well-told story without questioning if there might be another side to the events. The final straw came when Kevin posted a story on his account showing the house he and Jessica had bought, showcasing the renovations they had done, the new furniture they had acquired, the perfectly designed garden, all presented as the fruit of their hard work and dedication. There was not a single mention of the fact that a significant part of all this had been paid for with money that wasn't his, with credit that had been fraudulently obtained using my personal information. He displayed it all with so much pride, so much satisfaction, as if he truly believed he had earned it himself, as if he had completely forgotten or simply didn't care that every brick of that house was partially built on the sacrifice and theft from his own mother. I watched him live his life in those small digital windows and wondered how it was possible for someone to sleep at night, knowing what they had done. How was it possible to maintain that facade of a successful, ethically correct person while simultaneously committing fraud and theft against the person who gave him life? I wondered if he ever felt guilt, if ever in the middle of one of those fancy dinners in expensive restaurants or during one of those gym workouts, he stopped for a moment and thought about his mother sitting alone in an empty house after having sold her furniture just to be able to eat because her own son had been systematically robbing her for years. But looking at his posts, seeing the ease with which he built and maintained this perfect public image, I came to understand something fundamental about Kevin, something I may have always known on some level but never wanted to fully admit to myself, and that was that my son had developed the ability to create parallel realities in his mind. In one reality, he could be simultaneously the abandoned son who deserved compensation and the successful man who had built everything himself. In another, he could justify theft as something he was rightfully owed, while publicly presenting himself as a victim of family toxicity. It was a form of cognitive dissonance so profound that it almost seemed as if he genuinely believed his own lies, as if he had constructed such an elaborate narrative in his head that the line between truth and fiction had been completely erased. And as I watched all this from the silent distance of my empty house, something inside me hardened even more than it already was. Because seeing Kevin not only steal from me, but also steal my story, completely inverting the roles of victim and perpetrator in his public presentation of events, made me understand that there was no possible redemption here. There was no conversation I could have with him that would make him see the reality of what he had done. He had chosen his path. He had chosen the lie over the truth. He had chosen image over substance. And I needed to accept that the son I had raised and loved had never really existed in the way I believed, or had been completely replaced by this stranger who could smile for the camera while destroying his mother in private, apparently without feeling any genuine remorse. One evening, as I sat alone in my kitchen drinking tea, I heard a soft knock at the door. It wasn't Kevin's aggressive knocking. This was gentler, almost hesitant. When I opened the door, I was surprised to see Jessica standing there alone. She looked different somehow, less polished, less sure of herself. Her perfect makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes, and her usually immaculate hair seemed slightly disheveled. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let her in. She walked into the empty living room and looked around, her eyes lingering on the bare spaces where furniture used to be. "Kevin doesn't know I'm here," she said, turning to face me. "He would be furious if he knew." I didn't respond. I just waited for her to continue. She sat down on the floor. There were no chairs, and I sat across from her. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. "I found this in Kevin's desk drawer," she said, handing it to me. "I was looking for a pen and I found this." I opened the envelope. Inside were several credit card statements, all in my name, all for cards I had never applied for. There were also printouts of bank transfers from accounts I didn't recognize into Kevin's personal account. The dates, amounts, and account numbers were all clearly visible. "How long have you known?" I asked, looking up from the papers. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "I suspected something was off for a while. Kevin always had more money than made sense given his salary, but I didn't want to know the details. I told myself he was just good with investments or that he had savings I didn't know about." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "But after your confrontation, when he came home, he was different. Angry, defensive, paranoid. He started shredding documents, deleting emails, and then I saw that post he made about you being toxic, and it didn't feel right. So you decided to dig deeper." She nodded. "I'm not proud of what I found, or of my part in all this. Those Friday dinners, I knew they were about more than just visiting you. It was free food. It was Kevin checking if you had bought anything new that he could, I don't know, calculate into his plans." I looked at the papers in my hands, then back at Jessica. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the loyalty to her husband battling with what appeared to be a genuine sense of shame. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. "Because it's wrong," she said simply. "Because I have a mother too, and I would never do to her what Kevin has done to you. Because I'm starting to wonder what kind of man I really married." There was a vulnerability in her voice I had never heard before, a crack in the cold, calculating facade she had always presented. "Kevin has changed," she continued. "Or maybe he was always like this, and I just didn't see it. He talks about you like you're an obstacle to overcome, not a person to love. And the way he justified taking your money, saying you owed him for the childhood he had, for the father who wasn't there, it started to sound unhinged." She took a deep breath. "I don't know what to do. I'm scared of what he might do next, of what he's capable of. But I'm also scared of leaving. We have the house, the lifestyle. Everything is tied together." I looked at Jessica, really looked at her for the first time. Behind the designer clothes and the perfect makeup was a woman who was beginning to realize she might be married to someone who wasn't who she thought he was. I felt a complex mixture of emotions, anger at her complicity, but also a strange empathy for the difficult position she was in. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe just to tell you I'm sorry, and to give you these papers. They might help your case." She stood up, smoothing down her skirt with trembling hands. "I should go. Kevin will be home soon. He can't know I was here." I walked her to the door. As she was about to leave, she turned back. "Denise," she said, "be careful. Kevin isn't thinking rationally anymore. He's obsessed with the idea that you're trying to ruin him. Just be careful." After she left, I sat for a long time looking at the papers she had given me. They were the missing pieces of the puzzle, the final evidence I needed. But they also represented something else, a crack in the perfect image Kevin had been trying to project, a sign that his carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. I called Eric Morgan and told him about Jessica's visit and the documents she had provided. His voice grew serious. "This changes things, Mrs. Reed," he said. "With these documents, we can move forward more aggressively. But I'm concerned about what your daughter-in-law said about Kevin's state of mind. Perhaps we should consider a restraining order." A restraining order against my own son. The idea still felt surreal, like something that happened to other people, in other families, not in mine. But then I remembered the coldness in Kevin's eyes when he threatened me, the calculated way he had been stealing from me for years, the ease with which he had turned our story upside down in public. "Let's do it," I said, my voice firm. "Let's do whatever is necessary." That night I had a dream about Kevin as a little boy. He was maybe 6 years old, sitting on my lap as I read him a story. His small hand was resting on mine, trusting, loving. I woke up with tears on my face, mourning not just the son I had lost, but the son who perhaps had never truly existed the way I believed he had. As I lay in the darkness, I wondered if there had been signs I had missed, moments where I could have intervened, could have steered him in a different direction. Had I been too permissive, too strict, too focused on working to provide that I had missed teaching him the values that mattered most? But as dawn broke, I realized that while I might have made mistakes, all parents do, the choices Kevin had made as an adult were his own. The decision to steal from me, to lie to me, to manipulate me, those were not the result of my parenting, but of his own moral failings. And with that realization came a kind of peace, a release from the burden of guilt I had been carrying. I got up, made a cup of coffee, and sat by the window watching the sunrise. Today was a new day, and I was ready to face whatever it would bring. The meeting with Eric Morgan was scheduled for 10 a.m. on Thursday. I arrived early, nervous but determined. The office looked different this time, less intimidating, more like a place where I might find solutions rather than just confirmation of my problems. Eric greeted me warmly and ushered me into his office. On his desk were all the documents I had provided, plus the ones Jessica had given me, organized in neat stacks. "Mrs. Reed," he began, "I've reviewed everything, and I've also consulted with a colleague who specializes in elder financial abuse cases." He must have seen me flinch at the word elder, because he quickly added, "That's just the legal terminology. It refers to the exploitation of older adults, typically by family members or caregivers." I nodded, letting him continue. "The evidence is overwhelming. The unauthorized withdrawals, the fraudulent credit cards, the utility accounts in your name, it all constitutes serious financial fraud. The question now is how you want to proceed." He leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. "We have two main options. The first is to send a formal demand letter to your son, giving him the opportunity to return the stolen money and compensate for the damages before we proceed with more severe legal action." "And the second option?" I asked. "The second option is to file a formal lawsuit immediately, which would become a matter of public record. Anyone who wants to verify the truth could do so, rather than simply believing the version of events your son has been constructing on social media." I sat silent for a moment, considering the options. The first one appealed to the part of me that was still his mother, that still harbored a small, irrational hope that if Kevin were confronted with the irrefutable evidence of what he had done, maybe something in him would awaken. Maybe he would find some vestige of conscience or remorse, or at least the basic acknowledgement that he had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. But the stronger, clearer part of me knew exactly what Kevin would do with that opportunity. He wouldn't take it as an extension of grace, but as a confirmation that I was too weak to truly harm him, that he could continue manipulating and controlling me because at the end of the day, I would always give in because I was his mother. And mothers always forgive, always give another chance, always choose love over justice. That part of me understood that giving him a private warning would only give him time to prepare his defense, to hide more evidence, to build an even more elaborate narrative of victimization that he could use publicly to destroy my credibility before I could act. "I want to file the lawsuit," I said firmly. "I don't want to give him the opportunity to respond in private where he can continue controlling the narrative and manipulating the situation in his favor." Eric looked at me with what appeared to be a mixture of surprise and respect. He probably didn't expect a woman my age to make such a direct and unambiguous decision. "I understand," he said. "I'll proceed immediately with the preparation of all necessary documents. Your son will be officially notified within the next 72 hours. As I left his office, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Power. The power of having made a decision completely by myself, without consulting anyone, without asking permission, without worrying about how it would make me look to others, or whether people would think I was being too hard on my own son. For the first time in decades, I had chosen to protect myself over protecting another person's feelings or reputation, even when that person was my son. And that choice, although painful, filled me with a sense of integrity I had forgotten was possible to feel. The notification reached Kevin on a Thursday morning, as Eric confirmed to me by phone. Although I wasn't there to witness his initial reaction, I could perfectly imagine the moment he opened that official envelope and read the documents detailing every fraudulent transaction, every unauthorized account, every dollar he had stolen, meticulously documented with dates and bank reference numbers that made any denial impossible. I didn't have to wait long to confirm my imagination, because less than 2 hours after receiving the notification, my phone started ringing with an insistence that bordered on desperation. Call after call, which I let go to voicemail without answering because I had nothing left to say to Kevin that wasn't already contained in those legal documents. I listened to the voicemails later that night when I finally felt emotionally prepared to do so, and it was fascinating in a disturbing way to listen to the progression of his panic through each successive message. The first one still tried to maintain some composure, with that controlled voice he used when trying to seem reasonable, telling me this was a terrible misunderstanding, that we needed to talk immediately, before things got more out of control. The second message already had a different tone, sharper, more urgent, where he pleaded with me to call him, that this was going to ruin his life, that I should please think about what I was doing before destroying my own son, as if I were the one destroying something instead of simply revealing the destruction he himself had caused for years. By the fifth message, Kevin was no longer trying to sound reasonable or appeal to my maternal compassion. He had completely devolved into rage and barely veiled threats, telling me I was going to regret this, that he had his own lawyers who would prove I was a senile old woman who didn't know what I was doing, that he was going to fight this with everything he had, and that in the end, I was going to look like the villain in this story. I listened to every message until the end, without allowing myself to feel anything more than a kind of clinical curiosity about how a person could transition so quickly from pleading to threatening, when they realized their usual manipulation tactics no longer worked. The following days were a whirlwind of legal and emotional activity because Kevin didn't stand still. He began his own counterattack campaign, starting by publishing a long and elaborate statement on his social media about how he was being victimized by a terrible injustice perpetrated by a mother he supposedly loved, but who was now legally attacking him for reasons he couldn't fully comprehend. His post was carefully worded to generate maximum sympathy without mentioning any specific details of the accusations against him, painting himself as the confused and hurt son who was being dragged through a traumatic legal process by a mother who might be experiencing age-related mental health issues. The response to his post was exactly what he expected, with dozens of comments expressing shock and solidarity, telling him to keep his head up, that the truth would eventually prevail, that they were on his side no matter what. And I watched all this from a distance, with a mixture of awe and revulsion at his ability to manipulate the narrative even when faced with documented legal charges. But something had changed in me, because this time, his public theater didn't affect me in the same way it had before. This time, I knew I had something more powerful than his carefully constructed words, and that something was irrefutable legal documents that couldn't be manipulated with emotional rhetoric or appeals to sympathy. Kevin's real collapse began when his own lawyers reviewed the evidence against him and apparently told him something he didn't want to hear. His social media posts suddenly stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening in its eloquence. Eric Morgan informed me that Kevin's legal representatives had contacted him, asking about the possibility of reaching an out-of-court settlement, which basically confirmed that they knew he had no real defense against the evidence I had presented, and that his best option was to try to minimize the damage before this proceeded to a public trial where all the dirty details would be revealed in public access documents. That's when the cracks in Kevin's carefully constructed life began to show. Apparently, some of his closest friends had started asking uncomfortable questions after Jessica casually mentioned at a social gathering that they were dealing with a complicated family legal problem. Once people started digging a little deeper, they discovered the public lawsuit documents detailing the specific accusations of financial fraud. Sarah Washington told me she had heard from other neighbors that Kevin's name was being mentioned in neighborhood conversations in ways that were definitely not flattering, that the people who had once seen him as the successful, educated son now looked at him with suspicion and distrust. Jessica was apparently furious, not necessarily about the moral implications of what Kevin had done, but about the damage to their social reputation. According to rumors that reached my ears through the neighborhood gossip network, there had been considerable fights in their house about how to handle the situation. Kevin tried to call me several more times during those weeks, but I maintained my absolute silence because there was nothing he could say to change the documented facts of what he had done, and my silence was apparently more devastating to him than any angry word I could have said, because it meant I had moved completely from anger to indifference, and that indifference was the final death of any power he once held over me. As I waited for the legal process to unfold, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. I had started as a young, single mother struggling to provide for her child, evolved into a woman who sacrificed everything for her son's future, and finally emerged as a person who had found the strength to stand up for herself, even against the person she had once loved more than anyone else in the world. It was a painful evolution, but also a necessary one. And as difficult as these past weeks had been, I couldn't help but feel that I was finally becoming the woman I was always meant to be. Not just someone's mother, but a complete person in my own right, with dignity, with boundaries, with self-respect. The call from Eric Morgan came on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 weeks after the lawsuit had been filed. "Mrs. Reed," he said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction, "I think we have a resolution. Kevin's lawyers have proposed a settlement that meets all our demands." I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that this painful chapter might finally be coming to an end, but sadness that it had come to this at all, that my relationship with my son had devolved into a legal battle with winners and losers, terms and conditions. "What are the terms?" I asked. "Full restitution of the $17,000 he took from you, plus $5,000 in compensation for damages and injuries. Additionally, he'll pay all fees for cleaning up your credit and our legal fees. All to be paid within a period of 6 months with verifiable monthly payments, or the agreement will automatically be invalidated and criminal charges will proceed without further warning." I nodded even though he couldn't see me through the phone. It seemed fair, perhaps even generous given what Kevin had done. "There's one more thing," Eric continued. "Kevin is fighting hard against one clause I insisted on adding, which requires him to issue a public statement acknowledging that he committed financial fraud against you and that the accusations in your lawsuit are true and substantiated." I understood immediately why Kevin would resist this clause more than any other part of the agreement. It would mean admitting publicly that everything he had been saying about being a victim of a toxic mother was a lie designed to cover up his own crimes. Keep the clause, I said firmly. It's non-negotiable. Eric's voice carried a note of respect. I'll let them know. And Mrs. Reed, I just want to say I admire your courage through all this. Not many people would have the strength to stand up to their own child this way. After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the quiet of my empty house, thinking about courage and strength and the strange, circuitous paths that bring us to the moments that define us. I had never thought of myself as particularly brave or strong. I had just been a woman trying to do her best, trying to raise her son well, trying to create a good life out of difficult circumstances. But somewhere along the way, I had found a kind of strength I didn't know I possessed, the strength to face hard truths, to make difficult decisions, to choose my own well-being even when it meant causing pain to someone I loved. And in that moment, sitting alone in my empty house, I realized that maybe that was what true courage looked like. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. Not the absence of love, but the wisdom to know when love needed to take a different form than the one we had imagined. The final battle was yet to come, but for the first time since this all began, I felt genuinely ready for it. Ready to face whatever came next, not just as Kevin's mother, but as Denise Reed, a woman who had finally found her own voice and was determined never to lose it again. The final settlement was reached 3 months after I filed the lawsuit, and the terms were exactly what Eric Morgan and I had established as the minimum acceptable. Kevin had no choice but to accept when his own lawyers explained that going to trial would mean not only the complete public revelation of all the fraud details, but also the very real possibility of criminal charges that could result in jail time. He had to return the full $17,000 plus another $5,000 in compensation for damages and injuries, in addition to paying all the fees for cleaning up my credit and my attorney's fees. And all of this had to be paid within a period of 6 months with verifiable monthly payments, or the agreement would automatically be invalidated and criminal charges would proceed without further warning. But beyond the money, which honestly had never been the main point of all this, the agreement included a clause that I had insisted on adding, and which Eric Morgan initially thought was unnecessary, but which for me was absolutely essential. That clause stipulated that Kevin had to issue a public statement acknowledging that he had committed financial fraud against his mother, and that the accusations in my lawsuit were true and substantiated. He fought that clause more than any other part of the agreement because he knew exactly what it would mean for his carefully cultivated image to publicly admit that everything he had been saying about being a victim of a toxic mother was a lie designed to cover up his own crimes. The statement appeared on his social media one Tuesday afternoon. It was brief and clearly drafted by his lawyers to minimize the damage as much as possible within the limits of what the agreement required. But still, the words were there in black text on a white background, admitting that he had accessed bank accounts without authorization, that he had opened credit cards using another person's information, and that he had committed serious errors in judgment that he deeply regretted. The comments under that post were wild, with people who had previously supported him unconditionally now expressing shock and disappointment, while others who had apparently suspected something all along felt validated in their doubts. I watched all that digital drama unfold with a sense of closure that had nothing to do with satisfaction or revenge, but simply with the quiet recognition that the truth had finally been spoken publicly. The first payment arrived in my account exactly on the specified date, and every subsequent payment also arrived punctually because Kevin knew that a single missed payment would mean consequences he definitely could not afford to face. With that money, I did something he might never have expected me to do. Instead of simply replenishing my savings accounts or using it to replace the furniture I had sold, I bought a plane ticket to a place I had never been before. I had spent 62 years living for other people, for my son, for the illusion of maintaining a family relationship that only existed in my imagination. And now, for the first time in my adult life, I had the freedom and the resources to live exactly as I wanted without having to justify my decisions to anyone. My destination was a small coastal town 3 hours from where I had lived all my life. I had read about it in a travel magazine years ago and had always thought I would visit someday. Someday had finally arrived. It was a quaint place with small, colorful houses perched on hills overlooking the ocean. The air smelled of salt and possibilities. I spent a week there, walking along the beach every morning, eating in little local restaurants, talking to shopkeepers and other tourists. On my 3rd day there, I found myself standing in front of a real estate office, looking at the properties displayed in the window. There was a small 2-bedroom house with a garden, just a few blocks from the beach. The price was $200,000. I don't know what made me walk in and ask about it. Maybe it was the feeling of freedom that had been growing in me since the lawsuit was settled. Maybe it was the realization that at 62, I still had time to start a new chapter in my life. The real estate agent, a woman named Linda who was about my age, showed me the house that afternoon. It was perfect. Not too big, not too small, with large windows that let in the sunlight and a backyard where I could plant flowers. Flowers I had always wanted to grow, but never had the time for when I was working 2 jobs. "Are you just visiting or thinking of moving here?" Linda asked as we stood in what could be my new living room. "I think I might be moving," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. 2 days later, I made an offer. The week after that, it was accepted. I used a combination of Kevin's payments and the savings I had managed to protect in my new bank account to pay for the house in cash. When I signed the purchase papers, I felt something I could only describe as a rebirth because this house was mine, in a way no other place had been mine before. Bought with money that had been returned through justice, not earned through endless sacrifice. I returned to my old apartment to pack my things, what little I still had after selling most of my furniture. Sarah Washington came to help me. "So you're really doing it," she said as she wrapped my few dishes in newspaper. "You're really starting over." "I am," I nodded. "At 62, who would have thought?" She smiled, a wide, genuine smile that made her look years younger. "It's never too late, Denise. Never too late to find your happiness." As we were finishing packing, my phone rang. It was a number I recognized instantly, Kevin. I had not spoken to him since the settlement was finalized. I hesitated for a moment, then answered. "Hello, Kevin," I said, my voice calm and steady. "Mom," he said. His voice sounded different, smaller, more humble. "I heard from Mr. Thompson next door that you're moving. Is that true?" "Yes, it's true. I bought a house in Cedar Bay." There was a pause, then, "Can I see you before you go? Can we talk?" I thought about it for a moment. Part of me wanted to say no, to close that door forever, but another part recognized that this might be our last chance for any kind of closure. "All right," I said. "You can come tomorrow at 10 a.m., but just you, not Jessica." "Thank you," he said, and for a moment he sounded like the boy I once knew. "I'll be there." After I hung up, Sarah looked at me with concern. "Are you sure about this, Denise? After everything he did?" "I'm not sure of anything," I admitted, "but I think I need to see him one last time. Not for him, but for me. For my own peace." The next morning, Kevin arrived exactly at 10 a.m. He looked different, thinner, paler, with dark circles under his eyes. He stood awkwardly at the door, as if unsure whether he was allowed to cross the threshold. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. He walked into the empty apartment and turned to face me. "It's really empty," he said. "Yes. Well, I'm moving, remember?" He nodded, looking at the floor, the walls, anywhere but directly at me. Finally, he took a deep breath and met my eyes. I don't know how to start, he said. I don't know what to say. Then why did you want to see me? I asked. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he had had since he was a teenager. I needed to see you before you left. I needed to know if there was any chance, any possibility at all, that someday you might forgive me. I looked at my son, this man who had stolen from me, lied to me, threatened me, and yet who still carried in him fragments of the child I had raised. And I felt a complex emotion that was neither forgiveness nor hatred, but something in between, something that acknowledged both his capacity to hurt me and the bond that would always exist between us, whether I wanted it or not. Kevin, I said, choosing my words carefully, I don't hate you. I don't wish you harm. But what you did, what you were planning to do, it broke something fundamental between us, something that I'm not sure can ever be fully repaired. I know, he said quietly. I know that now. I've been seeing a therapist, trying to understand why I did what I did, why I felt entitled to your money, why I could justify hurting you. And what have you learned? I asked, genuinely curious. He sighed deeply. That I've been angry for a long time. Angry about growing up without a father. Angry about watching you work so hard. Angry that you gave everything for me and made me feel like I owed you something in return. But that's not an excuse. There is no excuse. What I did was wrong. Period. I nodded, acknowledging his words without necessarily accepting them as adequate. Jessica left me, he continued, after the settlement, after the public statement. She said she couldn't be with someone who would do that to their own mother. She said it made her wonder what I might do to her someday. I felt a pang of sympathy despite myself. I'm sorry to hear that. Don't be, he said, shaking his head. She was right to leave. We weren't good together. We brought out the worst in each other. We stood in silence for a moment, the space between us filled with years of unspoken words, of misunderstandings, of pain. Will you ever come back to visit? He finally asked. I considered the question carefully. I don't know, Kevin. Right now, I need space. I need time to heal, to build my new life. Maybe someday, when enough time has passed, when the wounds aren't so fresh, maybe then we can try to have some kind of relationship again. But it won't be the same. It can't be. He nodded, his eyes glistening with tears. I understand. I do. I want you to know that I'm going to try to be better, to be the kind of person who deserves a second chance, even if I never get one. As he turned to leave, he stopped at the door and looked back. I'm sorry, Mom. Not just for the money, for everything. For taking you for granted. For not seeing how extraordinary you are. For wasting all those years when I could have been a better son. And then he was gone, walking out of my apartment and, in many ways, out of my life. I stood in the empty space, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and liberation. The conversation hadn't been perfect. It hadn't magically healed all the wounds between us, but it had given me something I hadn't realized I needed: closure. The acknowledgement, however belated, that what he had done was wrong and that the price he was paying was justified. As I finished the last of my packing that afternoon, I felt lighter, as if I had put down a burden I'd been carrying for too long. The next day, I would drive to my new home, my new life. And while part of me would always be Kevin's mother, I was now, first and foremost, Denise Reed, a woman who had finally found the courage to put herself first. The drive to Cedar Bay took 3 hours, but it felt like a journey across time and space, not just geography. Each mile that passed beneath my wheels seemed to take me further from the person I had been, and closer to the person I was becoming. I arrived in the early afternoon when the sun was high and the little town was bustling with locals and tourists. I drove directly to my new house, my house, bought with my money for my pleasure. The real estate agent, Linda, was waiting for me with the keys. "Welcome home, Denise," she said, handing them to me with a warm smile. Home, such a simple word, and yet it had never felt so meaningful. I unlocked the door and stepped inside into spaces that were empty but full of possibilities. The sunlight streamed through the windows, creating patterns on the wooden floors. I walked from room to room, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness, imagining what each space would become. The first night, I slept on an air mattress in the middle of what would be my bedroom. I had brought only the essentials, some clothes, a few personal items, books I couldn't bear to part with. Everything else I would buy new, piece by piece, taking my time to choose exactly what I wanted, not what was practical or necessary or affordable. The next morning, I woke up with the sunrise. I made a cup of coffee in the small travel kettle I had brought and sat on the porch, watching as the town came to life. The air was fresh and salty, so different from the city air I had breathed all my life. I spent the first few days settling in, learning the rhythms of my new neighborhood, finding the best place to buy groceries, the coffee shop with the friendliest staff, the bookstore with the most interesting selection. On the fourth day, I bought my first piece of furniture, a comfortable armchair where I could sit and read. On the fifth day, I bought a small dining table and 2 chairs. By the end of the second week, my house was beginning to look like a home, not filled with expensive or fancy things, but with items I had chosen carefully. That brought me joy. But the most important purchase was the one I made in my third week: plants for my garden. I bought roses, dahlias, lavender, and herbs like basil and mint. I spent an entire weekend digging in the soil, planting, watering, getting dirt under my fingernails, and not caring in the slightest. As the weeks turned into months, I settled into a routine that was entirely my own. I woke up when my body wanted to wake up, not when an alarm clock forced me to. I cooked meals that I liked, not thinking about someone else's preferences. I spent my afternoons reading books I had always wanted to read but never had time for, and in the evenings I sat on my porch listening to the distant sound of the waves and feeling a deep gratitude, not for what I had in material terms, but for what I had finally understood about my own worth. Sarah Washington came to visit me every few weeks, bringing gossip from the old neighborhood and news of people we used to know. She told me I looked different now, lighter, more alive in ways that went beyond the physical. And she was right. I felt different. I felt as if I had shed not just the burden of a toxic relationship, but also decades of conditioning that had taught me a mother's value was measured only by how much she could give and how much she could endure. I had learned that saying no was an act of self-love, that setting boundaries was not cruelty but necessity, and that protecting your peace was not selfishness but wisdom. And now I lived every day as a testament to those lessons, learned too late perhaps, but not too late to matter. 6 months after I moved, when Kevin had made the final payment as required by the settlement, he sent me a letter. Not an email, not a text, but a handwritten letter that arrived in my mailbox on a sunny Tuesday morning. I took it to my garden and sat on the bench I had placed among my now blooming flowers. With steady hands, I opened the envelope and began to read. The letter was long, several pages of Kevin's distinctive handwriting. He wrote about his therapy, about the painful realizations he had come to regarding his behavior, about the sense of entitlement he had carried with him since childhood. He wrote about his regrets, his hopes, his understanding that he might never be able to fully repair what he had broken. At the end of the letter, he included a recent photo of himself standing in front of a community center, He explained that he had started volunteering there, working with at-risk youth from single-parent homes, trying to help them avoid the patterns of resentment and entitlement that had consumed him. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask to visit. He simply wrote that he hoped I was finding peace and happiness in my new life, and that if I ever wanted to reach out, his door would always be open. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. Then I sat for a long time, watching the bees move from flower to flower in my garden, thinking about forgiveness and redemption and the complex ties that bind us to those we love, even when that love becomes tangled with pain. I didn't write back that day or the next. I needed time to process what he had written, to decide if and how I wanted to respond. But I kept the letter in the drawer of my bedside table, and sometimes at night I would take it out and reread parts of it, feeling the weight of our shared history but also the possibility, however faint, of a different kind of future. 3 more months passed. My garden flourished. I made friends in the town. Linda, the real estate agent, who invited me to join her book club. Marcus, the owner of the coffee shop, who saved the daily crossword puzzle for me. Elena, a retired teacher who lived 2 houses down and shared my love of gardening. I found a part-time job at the local library, not because I needed the money, but because I enjoyed being surrounded by books and helping people find exactly what they were looking for. Life settled into a pleasant rhythm, one that I had created entirely for myself. And then one day, as I was watering my flowers, I found myself thinking about Kevin's letter, about the photo of him at the community center, and I realized something important. I was ready, not to forget or to pretend the pain had never happened, but to see if there was a way forward, a path that acknowledged the past but wasn't defined by it. That evening, I sat at my dining table and wrote a letter of my own. I told Kevin about my new life, about my garden, my friends, my job at the library. I told him I was glad to hear about his volunteer work, that it seemed like a positive step. I didn't promise forgiveness or a return to the way things were before. Those things weren't possible. But I did suggest that perhaps, if he wanted, he could visit me someday, see my new home, walk with me on the beach. It was a small opening, a narrow bridge across the chasm that had formed between us. But it was a beginning. A week later, Kevin called. We spoke for 20 minutes, our conversation cautious, but civil. He asked if he could visit the following month, and I agreed. We set a date, and when we hung up, I felt a strange mixture of anxiety and hope. The day of his visit arrived sunny and clear. I spent the morning in my garden, finding peace in the familiar routine of tending to my plants. At noon, I heard a car pull up in front of the house. I took a deep breath, wiped my hands on my gardening apron, and went to the front door. Kevin stood on my porch, looking nervous but presentable in a button-down shirt and jeans. He had a small potted plant in his hands, a peace lily. "I thought you might like this for your garden," he said, holding it out. I took the plant, our fingers not quite touching during the exchange. "Thank you. It's lovely. Come in." He followed me inside, looking around with genuine interest. "Your house is beautiful, Mom. It suits you." "Thank you," I said. "I'm happy here." We had lunch on the porch, the conversation slightly stilted but not uncomfortable. He told me about his volunteer work, his new apartment, the online classes he was taking in counseling. I told him about my life in Cedar Bay, my job at the library, the friends I had made. After lunch, we walked down to the beach. The tide was out, revealing a wide expanse of sand. We walked along the water's edge, our footprints washing away behind us with each incoming wave. "I want to thank you," Kevin said suddenly. "For what?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. "For giving me consequences," he said. "For not letting me get away with what I did. For forcing me to face myself." I looked at him, surprised by his words. "I didn't do it for you, Kevin. I did it for me." "I know," he nodded. "But it helped me too, even though I didn't want to be helped. It forced me to change, to grow up in ways I should have grown up years ago." We walked in silence for a while, the only sound the gentle lapping of the waves and the distant cry of seagulls. "I can't promise we'll ever have the relationship we once had," I finally said. "Too much has happened, but maybe we can build something new, something honest, something based on who we really are, not who we wish the other person was." Kevin nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "I'd like that. I'd like to try." We turned then and walked back toward my house, the afternoon sun warm on our backs. I didn't know what the future held for us, whether this fragile peace would last or shatter under the weight of the past, but I did know that whatever happened, I would be okay. Because I had found myself in the midst of loss. I had found my strength in the face of betrayal. I had built a life that was truly mine, not defined by my role as a mother or by the sacrifices I had made, but by the choices I was making now, every day, for myself. As we reached my garden, I showed Kevin the flowers I had planted, the herbs that were thriving in the coastal air. He listened attentively, asked questions, seemed genuinely interested. And for a moment, just a moment, I glimpsed the possibility of healing. Not complete, not perfect, but real. That night after Kevin had left, I sat on my porch watching the stars come out. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the painful revelations, the difficult decisions, the moments of despair, and the moments of clarity. I thought about the woman I had been, so willing to give, so afraid to demand, so determined to be the perfect mother at the cost of her own well-being. And I thought about the woman I had become, still capable of love, still open to connection, but now firmly anchored in her own worth, her own boundaries, her own truth. This was my victory, not in the money recovered or in Kevin's public admission, but in the fact that I had recovered myself from decades of conditioning that had taught me a mother's value was measured only by how much she could give and how much she could endure. I had closed that door on my old life not out of vengeance, but out of dignity, and that distinction made all the difference because it meant I had won not by making Kevin my enemy, but simply by refusing to continue being my own. And as I sat there under the stars, surrounded by the garden I had planted with my own hands, I felt a deep peace settle over me. The kind of peace that comes from being exactly where you are meant to be, doing exactly what you are meant to do, being exactly who you are meant to be. It had been a long journey to get here, a journey of pain and discovery, of loss and gain, of endings and beginnings. But sitting there in the quiet of my new life, I knew with absolute certainty that it had been worth it. Every tear, every moment of doubt, every difficult decision, all of it had led me here, to this moment of quiet triumph, to this garden of my own making. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.